Now, Russia's President Vladimir Putin is floating the idea of putting Ukraine under the temporary control of the United Nations. Russia has repeatedly moved to discredit the legitimacy of Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelenskyy. Putin said he should be replaced with new leadership before direct peace negotiations could take place.
We could discuss under the auspices of the UN, with the US, with European countries, and of course with our partners and friends, the possibility of introducing temporary administration in Ukraine. What for? In order to hold democratic elections, to bring to power a viable government that enjoys the trust of the people, and then begin negotiations with it on a peace treaty. Sign legitimate documents that will be recognized around the world and that we can rely on.
Well, DW correspondent Juri Rescheto is with me now from Riga, where he's been operating since Russian authorities closed down DW's Moscow bureau. Juri, what is behind President Vladimir Putin's call for a temporary administration in Ukraine? What is he really proposing here?
Well, Putin's idea about temporary government in Ukraine under the patronage of the United Nations and other countries, including European countries, make perfect sense if you look at the recent history of Russian-Ukrainian relations. Since the so-called Orange Revolution in 1924, there has been a bitter struggle for the Kremlin's influence. In 2010, the pro-Russian President Yanukovych came to power with massive help from Moscow and was driven out of office in 2014 during the Maidan Revolution. Then Poroshenko and finally Zelenskyy came to power, both outspoken critics of the Kremlin, both outspoken friends of the West. Since then, Putin has been trying everything possible to remove Zelenskyy from power. The war in Ukraine, Christine, has repeated precisely this goal. And because Putin is not achieving this even with war, he is now trying, possibly with the help of the USA, that's new, to go through the UN with the idea of temporary administration. The other aspect is that, you said it, Putin has repeatedly refused to recognize Zelenskyy as the legitimate president for negotiations and has repeatedly called for elections in Ukraine. But because this is not possible due to the war, Putin now wants to legitimize his demands using the UN.
Yeah, and in those remarks, Juri, Mr. Putin had praise for Donald Trump. How is that playing inside Russia?
Well, look, since Trump has been in power, the Russians have been almost enthusiastic, thrilled about how things are developing. And Trump keeps giving them reason to do so with his concessions to Moscow. The Russians are also tired of the war. The Russians are also largely want the war to end. And the Russians, of course, want the sanctions to be eased or completely removed. But because the image of an enemy is very important for Russian propaganda to say why they are fighting at all and against whom, it's not the USA now, but Europe that is now the biggest enemy. In the Russian interpretation, the EU is at war with Russia and Trump helps to defend Russia from the EU.
All right, that's DW correspondent Juri Rescheto in Riga for us. Thank you, Juri. And let's get some analysis on this now from Alexey Yusupov. He is the head of the Russia program at the German think tank, the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Welcome to DW News. What do you make of this idea from the Russian President Vladimir Putin to put Ukraine under UN administration?
I agree with your colleague, Mr. Rescheto, that this is a continuation of the Russian strategy to diminish Ukrainian sovereignty. They tried different instruments in different phases, and the full-scale invasion is actually a proof that it hasn't really worked before. And now we hear that Putin reverts back to his very favorite instruments. You know, he's a lawyer by second training, and he likes to emphasize that institutions and treaties can be used if they accommodate great power interests. And so what he proposes here is something, you know, resembling the Bosnian architecture of international administration that would diminish Ukrainian sovereignty. And so the aim is the same, the strategy is the same, but it is new legal language about it.
Alexey, do you think that Putin is concerned about the efforts by France and Britain to send troops from a so-called European coalition of the willing in trying to get ahead with that in his UN proposal?
I think there is a big misunderstanding about the timing of the actual sending of those troops, because it sounds sometimes as if that would be a short short-term solution to reassure and support Ukraine in its defensive efforts. But actually, the European capitals, and if you talk to the military experts, the European military experts, they all know it. What they talk about is something resembling the enhanced forward presence the Europeans, the Western Europeans, already have in the eastern part of NATO and the European Union. So troops that are not on the battle line, somewhere deeper inside the country, and are a mixture of a tripwires or something that a second Russian invasion would stumble upon, and that give a political buy-in, to the Western European capitals to participate in the defense of however Ukraine would look like. So the European capitals are talking about the mid and long-term reassurance, whereas Putin is talking about the now and short-term idea of how to move forward. And if you listen carefully to him, he's very obsessed about this idea that President Zelenskyy is not legitimate. And this whole proposal is, in his view, showing a path to a different political solution, sidelining him. So it's not like these ideas actually meet on the same time horizon, though those are different time spans we're talking about here.
I mean, how do you think that Ukraine will react to the proposal? What will we see Kyiv do?
I mean, that's clear, and that would be consistent and logical. Talking about a sovereign nation as a territory which is in need of international governance is not compatible with the facts on the ground. It's a functioning state. It has a society which has a legitimate political structure above it, which it participates in. And yes, there hasn't been elections because the country is in war. But first, it's their own decision, and most of the countries have provisions like this. And second, this whole notion that, it's a civil war-torn territory like Yugoslavia, like Bosnia, and this is why great powers need to come in to administer what cannot be administered by the denizens of the territory itself. This is not compatible with any legitimate interests Kyiv has.
That is Alexey Yusupov from the Friedrich Ebert Foundation's Russia program. Thank you.